Well, hello everyone out there. Welcome back to another edition of the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And I'm your host, retired Army First Sergeant Paul Holbert. And thank you for joining us this evening. We appreciate you taking the time to either watch live or for those of you who watch the show on the many recorded platforms where it's posted, we appreciate that. We appreciate your participation and it's audiences like you that help us succeed. And I wanted to share something with you. We just got notice from Podseo, it was a podcast and data organization, that Going Solo is rated number 5 in searches on Spotify and Apple Podcasts when they search for veterans shows. And so we were rated number 5, and we're really happy about that. We're also rated number 9 when we're searched for veteran support. And of course, we were able to make the list of the top 25 podcasts in Northern Virginia to watch. And that's all because people like you out there in the audience. So we really appreciate your participation in watching our show. All right. And before we get started tonight, I have to mention our great sponsors. Nationwide IT Services is a disabled veteran-owned small business located up here in Northern Virginia. And folks, if you are in need for business help, whether it's IT, security, training, professional development, program management, whatever it is, CK Park and his crew there at NIS, they are available to help you as they do with their many clients around the United States. So please give them a call, tell them what your need is, and they'll be glad to talk with you. I also want to thank Hill and Ponton, PA, the Veterans Disability Attorneys. Hill and Ponton, located in Florida, have been in business for over 3 decades, and their main focus is to help veterans and veteran families with disability issues, navigating the VA, finding out what they're entitled to, what they can get, finding out the things that they've earned, and helping them for those who have difficulty navigating those systems. They're also posting up free webinars on the website that provide a lot of information, and there are other live ones that they schedule as well. So take a look at their website, hillandponton.com, and see if there's information there that can help you. All right, so I want to get into tonight's show and tonight's guest, and tonight we're bringing back Dr. Mitchell Maki. Mitch is the president and CEO of the Go for Broke National Education Foundation, who strives to make sure that we know the legacy of the Nisei warriors, the Japanese American veterans from World War II especially. Now, Mitch is a lead author of the award-winning book, Achieving the Impossible Dream. He's also spoken nationally and internationally on numerous occasions to groups interested in the Redress movement and what his organization is doing. And he's also served on the board of governors there locally, representing the Go for Broke National Education Center. So, Mitch, I know you were on a couple of months back, and you came on and shared with us what the organization was about. And we wanted to have you come back on and share a little bit more and kind of share some of the stories that you've amassed over the years of working there with our audience. But before we get into that, if you would you mind just kind of reminding the audience what it is you guys do for those who didn't watch the last show?
Yeah, well, thank you, Paul, and thank you for having me back. I'm delighted to be here. As you mentioned, I am the president of Go for Broke National Education Center, and we are located in downtown Los Angeles in the Little Tokyo district, right by City Hall. But our work not only takes place in Little Tokyo or in Los Angeles, but we create videos, we have a traveling exhibit, we tell the story across the nation and even internationally. And the story is about what happened to Japanese Americans during World War II. How here on the continental United States, Japanese Americans, simply based on their race and their ethnicity, were forced to leave the West Coast. They lost their homes, they lost their jobs, they lost their businesses. But most of all, what they lost was their sense of place at the American table of citizenship. They had their constitutional rights taken away, and they were imprisoned in concentration camps across the United States. And about a year into that experience, the US Army, realizing that they needed more men to go and fight, especially in Europe, decided to create a segregated unit of Japanese American young soldiers to go and fight for liberty and justice halfway across the world, while their own families were incarcerated in these camps. Now, just to get all the data out there and the facts straight, 2/3 of the Japanese Americans who fought were from Hawaii, and their families were not incarcerated. And the other third were from the continental United States and came from these camps. And I guess that's an interesting place for us all to start, is for your viewers. If you can imagine, you're 20 years old, you're male, you've had everything taken away from you, your family's been stripped of everything, and then you're asked to go and fight for the country that has done this for you.
Yeah.
But you know you're American, and that's key to this story, is that these young men, they were born and raised, and women too, were born and raised in America, and they knew in their heart of hearts they were American, and they knew in their heart of hearts that their future was in America and that their family's future was in America. And that was a big reason why they chose to fight. And they would go on to become the most highly decorated unit of their size in American military history. I mean, let that sink in for a second. Young men who had everything taken away and who had every reason in the world to say, no, I'm not going to go fight until you give me back my rights, or you give me back my semblance of being an American, would go on to become the most highly decorated unit. So we like to say this isn't a Japanese American story. This is an American story. Yeah. Because these were the sons and daughters of immigrants who in one generation demonstrated the very best values of our nation: courage, patriotism, service to others. That's the American way, and that's what these young men and women did. So that's what we do.
No, I think it's what really gets me, and what's really interesting, Mitch, is, I know this is a little different situation, but, during World War II, you had the Navajos who served in the Pacific with the Marines, I think, primarily. And, while they were not quite treated the same way as the Japanese Americans were, this was another group that went off and served the country when they had been treated poorly quite a bit through history, and, became the code talkers, that were able to keep the Japanese from understanding what was going on through communications. So, I mean, it's just another story of these different groups that make up our country that all contributed so immensely to the success of the war effort.
I think, Paul, it just shows that being an American is not a matter of the color of your skin, or the nation from which your family originally came, or even the religion that one chooses to keep in one's life. It's really a matter of values, and it's really a matter of understanding our democracy and what our country was founded on in terms of our constitutional rights. And you're right, it's not just the Japanese Americans, it wasn't just the Navajo code talkers, it was African Americans who served in the segregated units of the Tuskegee Airmen or the Buffalo Soldiers. And to add to that story, when African American soldiers came home, some of them were literally lynched in uniform. Others were beaten on the streets and in public transportation in uniform. And it hopefully is a reminder that we as a nation have come a long ways from that. Not to get too political at all, but I know there's a lot going on in our country today, and I know a lot of young people say to me, oh, it's so terrible, it's so terrible. And I say, yeah, it is terrible in some respects, but I also would much rather be Japanese American, African American, Native American today than 80 years ago. And I say that not to belittle what's going on, and that we're not a perfect nation by any way means, but we are an evolving nation, hopefully getting to that point of becoming a more perfect union. And thank you for having these stories on, because it's a reminder of how far we've come, but yet also how far we have yet to go.
Yeah, I just, I was on the site again actually yesterday, and I was looking, just kind of looking at some of the archives of the audio visuals you guys had on there, and it's some of them were really interesting, and I think just to look at the legacy of those people, of those soldiers during World War II, that you guys are trying to make sure that people understand and the word get out about. I have a difficult time placing myself in their position, because if that were me, I think I'd be pretty pissed off. And not saying I'm sure some of them weren't, but even with that, for them to go out in combat and distinguish themselves the way they did, I think was just amazing.
And I think to help everyone understand why did they choose to fight when, again, they had every reason to say no. One, they knew who they were. They knew they were American, and they knew that America was their home, right? And they also knew, and the thing to keep in mind, that during World War II, the Nazis were viewed as evil men. Yeah. The Japanese were viewed as an evil subhuman species. And for many Japanese Americans, we knew that the mainstream American public did not feel that we were worthy of American citizenship, that we didn't deserve it. And at that moment, when the nation turned to us and said, "We are calling upon you to serve," we knew that if we were to say no, we would be forever validating that perception of us as being unworthy Americans, or unworthy of becoming Americans. So these young men and women understood that they were fighting not only for themselves, not only for their immediate family, but for the future of generations of people that they would never know. Japanese American as well as all Americans, as we know that this is a story that speaks to the constitutionality of what it means to be an American.
Yeah, it's like I said, I'm kind of in awe when I read some of the material that you guys have up, because so much of this is new to me as well, that I was unaware of until just a little while back. And I know that you have all kinds of experiences with the organization and all kinds of stories. And I'm going to ask you to kind of start off, if you don't mind. There was one in particular that I saw, was a soldier named Joe Hayashi, and he was actually one of the Medal of Honor winners. And I was hoping you could share a little bit about his story with our audience.
Sure. And for those of your audience who might be in the Little Tokyo, Los Angeles area, or might plan on visiting, come by our exhibit, because we actually have Joe Hayashi's Medal of Honor on display. His family donated it to our center, and we built a special display case for it, and we talk all about it. And you're right. Joe was a young man, and he was a son of Pasadena, California. And Pasadena is about maybe 10, 12 miles north of Los Angeles. He grew up and went to the local high school. He was the all-American kid in the sense that he played football. He, just engaged in all kinds of activities that any teenager at that time would have engaged in. And then the war broke out, and Joe volunteered to serve. And he served with distinction until about 1 month before the end of the war. And that's the hardest part of this story for me to grapple with. It was about a month before the end of the war. Yeah. The unit was in Italy, in a small township called Tendola, and they were in a firefight with the Nazis. And Joe just was relentless and took out several machine gun nests single-handedly, chased the Nazis out. The Nazis were fleeing from the town. And if somebody could have just grabbed Joe at that time and said, "Okay, dude, you did good. You did what you had to do." But being the type of person, and I'm sure he was all fired up and the adrenaline was flowing, he chased the Nazis out of Tendola. But in doing so, they turned around, shot in his direction, and he was killed in action. And he was 25 years old. It was a month before the end of the war. So close to coming home, right? He didn't have that opportunity to come home. He didn't have that opportunity to have a girlfriend that would become his wife and have children and do all the things that so many of his fellow soldiers had done. His body is flown back to Los Angeles, and our exhibit is currently located in a former Buddhist temple. It was called the Nishi Honganji Buddhist Temple. We restructured it. We constructed it. So that's where we have our exhibit. But it is in our exhibit hall where the temple existed, and it's there that Joe's service was held. So in some ways, it's very fitting that it's right there. And he was buried about 2 miles away in a cemetery called Evergreen Cemetery. And at Evergreen Cemetery, there is a large number of Japanese American soldiers. 4 Medal of Honor recipients are buried there in close proximity to one another. And the reason that there are so many Japanese Americans, and in particular Japanese American soldiers, was that in the 1940s, that was one of the few cemeteries that would allow Japanese and Japanese Americans to be buried there. And so every few months we take our young adult supporters and we do a cleanup. We just did it this past weekend, clean it up and make sure that we pay our proper respects for people like Joe Hayashi, who's buried there, along with several other Medal of Honor recipients, and of course just veterans who served and either were killed in battle or were able to come home and just passed away later on. There's another veteran. His name is Sadao Munamori, and he is really he's the only Japanese American to have received this Medal of Honor during the World War II period. The other 20, there were 21 Medals of Honor bestowed upon this unit. The other 20 weren't bestowed upon the soldiers until 2000, when the Army did a review of all of their cases and said, clearly these medals were undervalued in terms of what was awarded to the soldiers, and that what they had done all merited receiving the Medal of Honor. But Sadao Munamori, who is in the Evergreen Cemetery, and there's a big statue of him. He's the one that received his medal during that time. His story was they were in the middle of a firefight, and he was running back to his foxhole, and he gets to his foxhole. He sees 2 of his buddies in the foxhole already, and a hand grenade comes in, and it lands right at their feet. And Sadao, without thinking about it, immediately jumps onto the hand grenade and curls his body around it, and he takes the impact of the hand grenade, thus giving his life, but saving his 2 comrades, his 2 buddies. And the story goes on to that Sadao would carry a photo of his mother everywhere he went during the war. And that photo was recovered from his body, and it had his blood staining it. And that photo was returned to his mother after the war. And I can't imagine what that's like. You know, I have 2 grown children, and just the idea of receiving my photo with their blood on it, I think would be incredibly painful. But again, here was a young man who, without second thought, I should say, sacrificed his life to save the life of his 2 fellow soldiers and his friends. Now, there's a very humorous side to this young man's life. His nickname was Spud. So Sadao Spud Munamori. Any guesses as to why his nickname was Spud?
I would just from my background knowledge, was he put on KP so often peeling potatoes or something that they called him Spud?
That would be a good one.
That was my first thought.
Well, you're right in the sense that it had to do with potatoes, but it was because Sadao was one of those rare Japanese Americans who enjoyed potatoes more than rice. His whole generation, they would eat rice much more than potatoes, but he liked potatoes, right? So he earned the nickname Spud. And so whenever we go and clean his grave area and freshen it up and so forth, we always bring a russet potato and make sure we put it on his grave marker.
You know what? Just briefly here before we're going to take a break, but I just wanted to add something into those stories. The story goes, those soldiers that are killed like that very young, they actually lose two lives. They lose the one they were living and the one they never got to finish living, when you think about it.
So eloquent. Yes.
Yeah.
That's so true.
So we're gonna take a quick break and hear from our sponsors, and then when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation with Mitch. So folks, hold on and we'll be right back.
In service of our nation, you gave everything you had. You sacrificed your comfort, your peace, and sometimes even your well-being. Over 3 decades, Hill & Ponton has helped to be a guiding light for veterans seeking their rightful disability benefits. When our heroes are in need, we are not just lawyers. We're an ally, a team who understands the struggles you faced. If you're a veteran seeking the benefits you deserve, let us stand with you on this journey, because every battle deserves a hero, and no hero should fight alone.
Living in a world filled with lunacy, it seems that stress and turmoil follow us everywhere we go. Perhaps it's gotten to the point where you wish you could turn off the distractions of daily living and have a good laugh. Well, we have a recommendation for you. Pick up a copy of The Dunce Cap, a humorous and satirical look at American society and the follies of our culture. Join the author Paul Holbert as he takes you on a trip through the nonsensical and often ridiculous practices of our everyday lives, from political correctness and our legal system to the folly of the media and our obsession with reality television. See how these and other outrageous practices of everyday people make us a perfect cast for the next slapstick sitcom. So go ahead, you know you need it. Take a frank look at the more nonsensical side of American society and see why we are prime candidates for the stool in the corner and the dunce cap that sits on top.
All right, welcome back, everyone. And you've been watching the WGSN-DB Going Solo Veterans Corner. And again, our guest tonight is Dr. Mitch Maki. And Mitch, of course, is from the Go for Broke National Education Center. And Mitch has been sharing with us some more of the stories, and we're glad to have him back again. Before the break, we were talking about a couple of the Medal of Honor winners among these they call them the Nisei veterans, right, Mitch? The Japanese American veterans from World War II. And I know, Mitch, that it wasn't just the men who served. I mean, you had cadet nurses, female Japanese American citizens, and who served as well. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Sure, and you are correct that it wasn't just young men who served. Toward the end of the war, in 44 and 45, the young women were given opportunities to either sign up to serve in the WACs or to serve as nurses or nurse cadets. And it was a different experience for them. One, of course, they weren't put into combat because at that time women didn't serve in combat, and they weren't put in a segregated unit the way the men were. That both had its benefits and its challenges, as you might imagine. So there's one nurse who's still alive today. Her name is Mary Tamura.
Oh,
And
wow.
Mary literally turned 100 years old. I believe it was last week, and she was honored at the Anaheim Ducks game here in Southern California. It was a military hero of the night, being honored. She was the military hero. And, normally it's a young man that's being honored, or maybe an older man and so forth. So for her, as a young Japanese American serving back in 44 and now being 100 years old. Wow. And the crazy thing, Paul, is it was the first hockey game she'd ever been to. And she's sitting there and she says, "Ooh, this looks quite exciting." And was really getting into it. But as she tells the story, one is that none of the nursing uniforms, and this is true for the nurses as well as for the WACs, none of them would fit because they were all too large. And so that, oftentimes they had to wear them and then they had to mend them and modify them so that they would fit. The other is that they would serve with no other Japanese Americans. They would be in units or in classes where they may be the only Japanese American. Maybe there was one other. And at first, she would talk about the very cool reception that she would have received. And again, many of the other white American nurses or white American cadets or WACs didn't have a lot of exposure to Japanese Americans, and so didn't know who is this person and why is she serving. But then, once they got to know her, once they got to see that, oh, she was born and raised in America, and she speaks English as well as any of us, and she likes the same things that we do, and she was a hard worker, because all of these young women who volunteered to serve, they understood that they weren't just representing themselves or representing their families. They were representing the whole community, and they needed to put their very best foot forward. And that's the story that we hear about with a lot of these young women, how they just performed exceedingly well and represented the community very well. And in doing so, earned the respect of their fellow nurses, of their supervisor nurses, or of the others in the Women's Auxiliary Corps. So again, this is a story not only of young men serving our country, but also young women serving our country.
So I want to ask you, Mitch, and maybe you can share with us a little bit about what their experiences were coming back home from the war. Because I mean, you know yourself, I'm sure you're familiar with the fact that even our young American men, when I say American men, I'm talking, non-Asian, other cultures, but our American men who came home, and women, some of them who came home from Vietnam, were treated very poorly. So how were these Japanese American veterans, these Nisei warriors, how were they treated when they came home?
Well, first of all, I think how our Vietnam veterans were treated is so very different than how our World War II veterans were treated when they came home. Our World War II veterans, and I'm talking in general, American veterans, were welcomed home, and there were parades for them, and people respected their service. And as we all know, that wasn't the case for many of our Vietnam vets who came home and to far less, and I'm being generous, far less than parades. They came back to some vile comments and so forth. and for as many different soldiers, Japanese American soldiers that came home, there's different stories, and it depends on where home was. Those returning to Hawaii, it was a little bit easier because there's so many other Japanese Americans, so many Asian Americans in Hawaii. Those returning to the East Coast of the continent had a different type of experience, partly because they were so few in number. And those who returned to the West Coast sometimes face some tremendous racism.
Yeah.
And I can give two very quick stories here. And one happens to involve Daniel Inoue. And for your viewers who may say, hey, I heard that name before.
Yes,
Daniel
Senator from
Inoue,
Hawaii. Yes.
Senator from Hawaii, exactly. Yeah. But during World War II, he enlisted and he rose to the rank of lieutenant during the war. And he literally lost his right arm in battle, right? And eventually he would be elected to the House of Representatives and then to the U.S. Senate from the state of Hawaii, which became a state in 1959.
Yeah.
And by the time he died in 2012, he was third in line to the presidency of the United States. Because there's the president, and then behind the president, there's the vice president, Speaker of the House, and then Senate Pro Tem. And Senator Inoue in 2012 was the Senate Pro Tem.
Oh, so I didn't know that.
You think about, and when he was 17 years old, that's when Pearl Harbor happened. And he was there at Pearl Harbor because he lived on Oahu. He remembers the planes flying in and attacking Pearl Harbor. And he said the planes were coming in so low that they could see the faces of the Japanese pilots, And he said when he saw the Japanese Zeros coming in and dropping the bombs, he felt like his life was forever changed because he knew that this was not going to go well for Japanese Americans. He then enlisted. He then served with distinction, would be one of those Medal of Honor recipients, and lost his right arm in battle. Well, on his way back to Hawaii, he came through San Francisco, and he wanted to get his hair cut. And so he went to the barber, and the barber looked at him, and he was in his American uniform, and his barber said, "We don't cut Jap hair," and kicked him out of the barbershop.
Gosh.
So that's one example, right? There's another story of a young man, and I may have told this story the first time I came on, but it's such an incredible story, I'd like to tell it again. And that is, there was a soldier named Kazuo Masuda. And Kazuo Masuda was asked, why are you fighting for a nation that has imprisoned your family and taken everything away? And his answer was the answer I think most of the Nisei soldiers would have given. And he said, because this is the only way that I know that my family can have a chance in America. Right or wrong, agree with him or not, Sergeant Masuda and the thousands of other Nisei soldiers understood that in 43, 44, and 45, loyalty needed to be demonstrated in blood. Well, 2 weeks after he said that, Sergeant Masuda was killed in battle in Italy, fighting for his nation, the United States of America. Now, fast forward 40 years later, and there's a bill going through Congress that would apologize to Japanese Americans for the incarceration and provide them with monetary redress payments, right? It passes the Congress, on the House of Representatives, on September 17th, 1987. 7 months later, it passes the Senate in April 1988. So now we just need one more supporter, and that, of course, is the President of the United States. And in 1988, the president was none other than Ronald Reagan, right? And Ronald Reagan, for those of us who remember him, was a very conservative president. And there were many people, and I have to admit I was one of them, who thought there's no way Ronald Reagan's going to sign this bill. It just felt too out of his sphere of things he could support. But we pushed on. And the thing about Ronald Reagan, you know, whether you agreed with his policies or not, most people would agree Ronald Reagan was a great communicator. You know, he had the ability to tell stories that would touch people's hearts and move them in a certain direction. The opposite was true of Ronald Reagan. If you could tell him a story that would touch his heart, you could have a great advocate on your hands. You know, so the question was, what story could we tell Ronald Reagan that would make him understand this issue on a very personal level? That's where Kazuo Masuda comes back into the picture. So, as I mentioned, he's killed in battle during the war. After the war, his family wants to move back to their home in Santa Ana, California. But they're met with nothing but hate speech, racial taunts, threats of bodily harm. You know, and the Army realizes this is a PR fiasco, that one of its own fallen heroes, his own family can't move back to their home. So they send out a contingent of Army officers to bestow a medal upon the family of Kazuo Masuda. It was the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest medal the Army gives. And they went and in front of the Masuda home, they presented his sister with the Distinguished Service Cross. And that night they had a rally, United America rally. And there was a young white American captain who spoke at that rally. Want to guess what his name was? Ronald Reagan.
Ah, okay.
Captain Ronald Reagan, because Reagan was a captain in the Army during World War II. So Captain Ronald Reagan spoke at this United America rally, and he said, the blood that is soaked into the sands of a beach is all of one color.
Yeah.
America stands unique in the world, the only country not founded on race, but on an ideal. Not because of, but not in spite of, but because of our polyglot background, we have had all the strength in the world. That is the American way. Mr. and Mrs. Masuda, as one member of the American family, to another, for what your son Kazuo did, thanks. That story was relayed to President Reagan in the 80s, and his response was, I remember what those soldiers did for America. And when he signed the bill on August 10th, 1988, he told that story, and he mentioned the Masuda family and how proud he was to be a part of that medal ceremony. So, you know, there's just a lot of variance in terms of how families were received, how the individual soldiers were received, but it varied. And of course, there are a number of stories where white Americans, because that was the primary group in the neighborhoods that Japanese Americans were moving back into, white Americans did the right thing in supporting these Japanese American families returning and supporting Japanese American soldiers and saluting them when they returned home from war. And it's an example of Americans doing the right thing in a time of crisis. You know, I'd like to share another story, which is a very positive story. We have a veteran who also is still alive today, Ed Nakamura, 100 years old. You know, and Ed and his family were sent off to Minidoka camp in Idaho. But Ed was able to leave the camp and get a work permit to work and go to school in Weiser, Idaho. And he was still in high school. And so he was the only Japanese American in his high school. And he became the star player on their basketball team. Now, he's a pretty tall guy. He's a little taller than me, so I guess he had the height to play basketball. But he was just so accepted by his basketball team. And he tells stories about when the team would travel, if they weren't allowed to eat in a certain restaurant, they wouldn't, you know, because of him, they would all say, we're not eating here. And we'll go someplace else that will feed all of us. And how he was so accepted by his high school classmates. On the day that he was drafted into the Army, and on the day that he had to leave Weiser by train, the high school band came out to serenade him at the
Oh.
train station and wish him well. And he tells that story with such pride about how he knew he was an American and how his classmates knew he was an American. And here's the kicker to the story. Like 30, 40 years later, he's down in Los Angeles. That's where he lives now. And he has a second house that he's renting out. And a young couple comes up and they're filling out the application. And he looks at it and they're from Weiser, Idaho. And this is 30, 40 years after the war. And he said, Weiser, Idaho? I used to live in Weiser, Idaho. And the young woman looks at him and she says, did you play basketball? And Ed goes, yeah, I did. How'd you know? He goes, my dad grew up in Weiser, Idaho, and he talked about a Japanese guy on the basketball team during the war and how he was so good. I mean, it was serendipitous.
Small world.
It was, a little small world time travel kind of thing, So those are the important stories to tell also, right? About how we as Americans have the ability to do the right thing in a time of crisis and to look beyond the hysteria and to look beyond the discrimination that unfortunately is present during those kinds of times and speak to our higher angels, if you will.
You know what? I got to tell you, Mitch, I mean, some of these stories you're sharing are incredible. And we've got to wrap up the show, but I want to tell you, I mean, these are amazing stories. And some of them are, things that, I sit and listen to and I just think, wow, it's you just don't expect it. But I just want to thank you so much for coming back on with us and sharing these stories with us tonight. And,
the gratitude is mine to you for inviting me back. And thank you for giving me this opportunity to tell the stories. And if I can just say that we really believe that these are not Japanese American stories. I mean, they are, obviously, but they're really American stories about the very best of what our nation can represent. And I'm sure veterans of all backgrounds have these same type of stories in different shapes and forms. And, thank you to all the veterans out there who have provided such great service and sacrifice to our nation. In Japanese, there's a phrase it goes, Okage-sama de, because of you, I am. And that's how I know we feel at Go for Broke National Education Center about all of our veterans. And I know that's how I personally feel as the son of a veteran. Thank you to the veterans. Because of you, I am. Because of you, our nation is.
Well, thank you, Mitch. I mean, that's pretty profound. I will tell you this before, as I get ready to close the show, I'm going to reach out to Aaron again, and I'm going to get you to come on later because I want you to share your dad's story as a Korean War veteran. So look for that. I'm going to reach out to Aaron, and we'll set something up. And for those of you out there in the audience that have been watching our show tonight, I'm sure these have been some really interesting stories. And, we want to thank Mitch for joining us again this evening. And as we close the show, don't forget, I'm always putting out information here that hopefully is useful to you out there in the audience. And if you go to Together We Served, you can see the website there, togetherweserve.com. It's a myriad of information. If you're a veteran, you can go on there and create an account, put your information in there, where you served, who you served with, and you can link up with so many other veterans over there. So I encourage you to go to togetherweserve.com, and they actually have a buddy link program. So for those of you out there in the audience, take a look at this. I went on there and registered, and I've already gotten emails about people that I served with, and it's a good contact to keep in touch, just like Mitch does with a lot of the folks in his group there. So give it a try. And Mitch, again, thank you so much for joining us this evening. I want to see you again. And for those of you who are veterans out there in our audience, as Mitch said, thank you so much for your services. We appreciate you and your family so much. And we hope to see you again on our next show.
Thank you for having me.